that I'm going to jump around on some, so bear with me, please. As Peter said, I am a public affairs consultant. My firm and I, we do represent the Texas Short Line and Regional Railroad Association in Austin. What public affairs means today is we are engaging and interacting with stakeholders across the board for our clients, including the Short Line and Regional Rail Association. Right this time of year, starting in January of odd-numbered years when the legislature meets for 140 days, most of my time is focused on those stakeholders who are policymakers in the building. And even though we may focus on the media or the public or try to bring all of those things together, nowadays, if you want to influence an outcome, you need to run a full issue campaign. It's like running a campaign for someone for elective office, but you're just trying to get an issue. You're trying to get the public policy priorities established for that issue on behalf of your clients. So that's, in a nutshell, what I do. I'll tell you a little bit about the legislative process. As I just mentioned, they meet every other year for 140 days. It's been that way since the 1870s during Reconstruction. The old adage in Texas is that no man's life, liberty, or happiness is secure when the legislature's in town. So our forefathers thought, well, just don't bring them to town very often. Within that 140 days, and I like to call this, I borrowed this from my friends at the electric co-ops a few years ago. I like to call this, for those of you who have small children or grandchildren, my chutes and ladders slide. This is, I won't go into detail on all of it, but there's one key thing I want you to see here. Everywhere, oh, that is pretty cool. I got to get one of these. Everywhere you see one of these red hands through this process, so here's when a bill gets filed, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Everywhere you see one of those red hands, that's somewhere that bill can die going through the process. And that's where it ends up if you're lucky. Less than 20% of bills filed, 7,000 roughly, average, in a session will actually pass. Most of those are non-substantive bills. Most of those are bills that, you know, they're not debatable. So it's a very difficult endeavor to try to affect public policy in a positive way. And a lot of what we spend our time doing is obviously trying to keep bad things from happening. But this session, there are already some things going on that I think are interesting and should be interesting to you guys and gals. As Peter mentioned, we have, typically we don't get committee assignments in the House as early as the Senate, and that was true this year. We have a new Speaker of the House. The previous Speaker served for 5 terms, which is a long time. The Speaker's elected by his colleagues, and so the new Speaker is kind of doing things a little differently. And one of the things he did a little differently is he appointed a House Chairman who's never, to my knowledge, ever even served on transportation, Terry Canales from the Valley, which is good and bad. It's great to have a new set of eyes, but lost a lot of institutional knowledge in the last few election cycles. A lot of turnover in the legislature. 150 members of the House, 31 members of the Senate, more than 2/3 of the House that is serving today, that is in Austin, was not there in 2011. So, huge amount of turnover in the House. These are some bills that I've thrown up here that are just what's been filed so far. They can file bills until March 8th, so you know, there's a lot of time for a lot of good things to happen, a lot of time for a lot of bad things to happen. They can file bills till March 8th. They can't take any bills up until then unless it's on the governor's emergency item list. So when you take that all together, and I have a deadline slide that I won't bug you with, but when you take those first 60 days, they can't consider any legislation. The last 20 days or so, they can only, the rules start to kick in, and it starts to make it harder and harder if a bill's not at a certain point for them to take that legislation up. So there's really about 60 days in the middle where they can actually send a bill through that whole chutes and ladders process that I just mentioned. And by the way, there are no chutes or ladders in there. You don't get to bypass go and miss all of those steps, miss all those red hands. A few of the bills that have been filed thus far this session, as we all know, high-speed rail has been a very hot topic for policymakers in the last few years in Texas. Not a lot, you know, there are a lot of new members, so there's a lot of education that needs to happen, but the opinions are typically fairly formulated and intense. They're either supporters or they're opponents. There's not a lot of, you know, in between, and I think you're going to hear some more about this later in the day, but thus far, as of about Wednesday, I think, Tuesday maybe, when I put this slide together, there had only been one bill filed by Representative John Ray out of Waxahachie that would have prohibited the use of private activity bonds for that purpose. And I think there will be more bills filed. I think it's going to be a very high priority for the legislature in terms of the topic of debate. I think there are a lot of folks who would like to see It happened because we, you know, in 2000, the state demographer said the state of Texas was going to have 25 million people by 2040, and that was an alarm that he was setting off. It's 2019, and we have 28 million people in the state, and no one could have anticipated the amount of population growth. And so, lots of pressure in that population growth, and I think you're going to see a lot of discussion about it, what it means, more than in the recent years past about rural versus urban, and those kinds of dynamics are going to play out in the legislative process. Another bill that's been filed, HB 742, by Yvonne Davis. She files it every session, or has at least for the past several sessions. I think around the country, as I understand, you see this pretty regularly. Railroad crew size requirements. And she actually is one of the new members of the House Transportation Committee. And that simply means that she sort of has an inside track to get her bills heard first if the chairman wants to give that sort of priority to his members, which is typically the protocol. HB 71 by Mando Martinez, he's pretty interested in creating these regional transit authorities that would include rail and passenger rail. I actually had dinner with Mando on Wednesday night, and he's pretty passionate about it. He also is on the House Transportation Committee and has served on there for a long time. Really probably one of the senior members, if not the most senior member, in terms of his understanding. So I know that'll be very important to him. And like I said, if I'm blowing through these, I have 20 minutes, so if you have any questions, stop me. And then this one's important. This is a good segue for the Short Line and Regional Railroad Association for what we're going to try to accomplish this legislative session. Senate Bill 66 by Jane Nelson, who is the chairwoman of the Senate Finance Committee that formulates the budget every cycle. She has a bill that would phase out the margins or franchise tax over a period of time. The margins tax was implemented in the mid-2000s. It's intended to be the most meaningful business activity tax in the state. It has underperformed. I think it has underwhelmed policymakers who hoped that it would be more efficient and more effective. So there's always an effort to phase the margins tax out. It's going to be an interesting dynamic. The Speaker, Governor, and Lieutenant Governor have already announced that public school finance is their primary concern this legislative session, which means money. And even though we have a $220 billion biennial budget, very little of that money is discretionary and available. So it's going to be interesting to see how that conversation that's going to require more funding from the state for public school finance will play into efforts to reduce or remove or repeal taxes altogether. The reason that that's important, let me see if I can do this right. The reason that's important, as I said, for the Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, we're working on a few things this legislative session that are important in terms of trying to find some resources to help these sort of critical infrastructure upgrades that are necessary. And the primary way to do this across the country, as you probably know, are through 45G type programs where you have a tax credit available that's assignable, and you use the revenue generated from that function for those critical upgrades. I'm happy to announce, it took some work to get it done this early, but as of when I put the slide together, as of yesterday afternoon, House Bill 1068 by Trent Ashby was filed, which would create a margins tax credit specifically for this purpose. The bill is filed, is going to need a little bit of work. The comptroller's office typically likes to be involved in that process in terms of determining how those tax credits are handed out. It's not a revenue mechanism, so it's not going to lower the amount of money that they have for the budget. What it's going to do is lower the amount of money coming in. It's not taking money that's in the budget out. It's going to lower the amount of money coming in. So having the comptroller's office involved is important, and in the bill that was filed yesterday, it's sort of the basis of those discussions. Anticipate that we'll see the same bill filed in the Senate. We're working on that, but it's really important. TxDOT in 2016 commissioned a study on this and determined that there was critical need for this rail infrastructure. And I can tell you, we've spent the last almost year talking to legislators about this and other stakeholders, and I've not had a single legislator tell me we don't need to do this. I mean, they all recognize the need. They all recognize its importance to the economic vitality of the state, and there's a ton of support. It's going to come down to those issues I mentioned earlier. the push and the pull of the budget circumstances and the legislative process. As I mentioned, I'm going to say it again, 7,000 bills, less than 20% of them, which means 80% die. So it's always a tough endeavor, but we've got a lot of good momentum. A lot of hard work has been put into it, and so would love to have as much support as we can, because I think it's important for the entire rail network, the entire transportation system in the state of Texas, and the entire Texas economy, that we get this done. So I think you're going to hear more about that as the session goes on. There will also be some other critical infrastructure efforts this legislative session. I have spent the last 18 months during the interim period since Hurricane Harvey listening to the legislature talk almost exclusively about Hurricane Harvey and disaster response and the state's readiness and preparedness for that. There's going to be a lot of discussion about our infrastructure as a state, civil, public, private, and whether we're prepared for those kinds of calamities when they come. Harvey was, for any of you who are in the area affected, was a horrible disaster, and I think that legislators really are really focused this legislative session on trying to make sure that they are prepared for the next one of those as they come along. I'm trying to not mesmerize you. I talk with my hands, and I'm trying to not do it too much, so I'm kind of keeping them in tight. So I think there will be opportunities for rail and some of these other critical infrastructure investment programs, and we've had some really good conversations. I think you'll see several bills filed that will try to find resources, creative ways to get more funding for these purposes. That TxDOT study I mentioned a few minutes ago, that was the key issue, the key component of that study that wasn't in there that I don't have to show legislators was how do you fund this? It always sort of comes down to there's a public need, how does the legislature go about addressing that public need? Moving on, another subject that you're going to hear a lot about, and we heard a lot about last session, authorizing heavy haul and heavier hauling trucks in certain regions of the state. The legislature passed a sort of what I would call a pilot program, allowing that in the Gulf Coast area from ports. There is an effort, again, by the oil and gas industry primarily, to authorize that in the West Texas Permian Basin oil and gas play. Anyone in this room, even if you're not from Texas, you got to know that we've got a lot of oil and gas activity going on in the state, and it's helping. It's also an economic driver, so it's important as well. There will be efforts to authorize that area as a heavy haul zone as well. It has tremendous impacts, consequences for the state to do that, and so policymakers are really going to have to decide what their priorities are. In transportation, the vast majority of the focus is on road funding, and the legislature has made that a priority in the last several cycles, giving billions and billions of new dollars for road building to try to address that population explosion that I mentioned earlier. They're going to have to weigh the consequences from a safety factor, from a cost factor, from a maintenance of those roads factor, where all of those kind of issues play into it together, and that's something that the Shoreline Regional Railroad, along with the Class 1 railroads, I know will all be involved in that discussion. And then finally, an issue that I think it will be a byproduct of some of these discussions that are ongoing about passenger and freight rail and about commercial logistics, the eminent domain fight that's gone on for a long time. You have large landowner groups, and this is where some of the rural and urban dynamics will come in. You have some of the large landowner groups that are already engaged and have been for quite some time on trying to limit the ability of key industries to utilize eminent domain for the better of the state. And so we're going to see a lot of discussion about this. In fact, there's already been a bill filed, HB 991 by Dwayne Burns, was filed earlier this week. Sort of first salvo. I do not expect it to be the last. But I think this is one of those issues that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about with our legislators and our policymakers this legislative session. And that's all I wanted to talk to you about today. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I think for anyone who was at the Short Line and Regional Rail Conference yesterday, I'm trying to not give you a deja vu moment all over again, said Yogi Berra. But, if you want to get involved, if you're interested in public policy, if you're interested in being engaged on behalf of the industry, there are a couple of ways to do it. The grassroots is a really key component of what I do. I can formulate the best digital media strategy that underpins the best advocacy, direct advocacy program in the world. And if I don't have the folks who are impacted by those public policy decisions engaged in talking to policymakers, I'm really missing out on an opportunity. So however you're able to do that, be engaged with your trade associations, with opportunities like this that brought you here today. Be involved and give that input to your policymakers, because it's a much different world now. The information age has changed that conversation that legislators have with their constituents. It used to be that they would come to Austin, do their work, go home, and go to the Rotary Club meeting and tell them what they did for the last 5 months. Nowadays, it is instantaneous. I was sitting in a meeting on Wednesday when they announced all of the House committee assignments. I was sitting in a meeting, in kind of a large group, and I looked around, and every person in that meeting was on their phone, because as they were announcing the committee assignments from the floor, they were being tweeted out by some reporter. And all of us were not paying any attention to the person who was talking, and I appreciate y'all paying attention to me, but we're all looking at our phones because we just couldn't wait. We couldn't wait 15 minutes till they released the entire list of them that I have here, and that's the world we live in. And so being engaged with your legislators is really important, and other policymakers. TxDOT is an important part of this, and I think rail is getting more of a priority focus from TxDOT, and I think that's a great trend, and I think being engaged there is important. Being politically active is very important. As I mentioned earlier, tons of turnover in this legislature in Texas. Getting folks elected, supporting folks for candidates who support your industry is really important, because if you're not careful, folks can be elected because they can say one thing, and they will come to Austin, and you may be surprised to hear this, do the exact opposite once they get to Austin. It happens to me a lot. But being engaged and helping those folks who understand the issues and understand what's going on get elected will, I promise you, pay dividends in terms of formulating good public policy when they go and convene the legislative session in January. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. Again, if you have any questions, here's some resources. If you have an interest in getting involved, the first one is just that Texas has a really robust online presence for the legislature. Lots of information available. If you have questions about bills or statutes or kind of what's going on, or you want to watch a committee hearing on your computer, that's all available at the Texas Legislature online, Texas Legislative Reference Library for anyone who's geeky enough to want to go read the history of how something came to be is a good resource. Texas Tribune is a news outlet that follows the state, and many of the major news outlets get their content from the Texas Tribune, so it's a valuable resource as well. And then obviously I've got to pitch the Texas Short Line and Regional Railroad Association website, because that's who I represent, but they're doing great work as well. So appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you. Happy to answer any questions you have. As long as I can answer them. I can tell you that 20 minutes is not, I can't tell you everything that's going on, because I don't know, and I won't know till May. So. Well, nobody's asleep. That's a good thing. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.